In this video, we will be replacing brush sections, brush holders, the drive pinion gears, and the axle on the Brinly 54-inch lawn sweeper with double helix brushes, model LS2-54-BH-G. Parts for the Brinly 54-inch lawn sweeper can be found on the Brinly Parts store online. Tools required: 2 8mm wrench and sockets, or drill bits. Note: the brush holder brackets will crack when tightening the bolts if the torque on a drill is too high. Hand tightening with wrenches is recommended, or using a very light amount of force with a power tool. Other tools required: 2 pairs of pliers, retaining ring pliers, and a flathead screwdriver for E-clips. First, make sure the hamper is disconnected, and set the sweeper standing upright on its base. Removing a brush section. Using 2 8mm wrench and sockets, remove the bolts from the brush holders and separate the 2 brush holder pieces, setting them and the hardware aside. Note: we recommend hand loosening with wrenches. If you are using an 8mm bit on a power tool, be sure to use a very light amount of torque on the bolts. Repeat this step for all 12 brush holder brackets, removing the nut on the back, sliding the bolt out, and separating the brush holder sections. Continue disassembling the brush clamps on the other side, remembering to use a very light amount of torque if you are using a power tool. Removing the brush holders. Next, remove the cotter pins, securing each of the 4 brush holders to the axle by straightening the pin ends with pliers, and then pulling the pins out of the axle and brush holder bases. Removing the axle. To remove the axle, straighten the ends of the cotter pin on the end of the axle and pull the pin out with pliers. Then slide off the small washer and the wheel and set aside. Note: for this step you will need a set of retaining ring pliers. Remove the retaining ring from the axle using the retaining ring pliers, then slide off the small washer and the pinion gear. Use caution removing the pinion gear, as the dowel pin will fall out of the hole in the axle. Note: there is a right and left pinion gear, noted by an L and R engraved on the inside of the gear. Check the dowel pin and the pinion gear for wear and tear. To check for wear and tear, check the inside of the pinion gears to see if the catch that keeps the brushes from spinning backwards has worn down at the catch located just behind the L or R engraving. Also be sure to check the dowel pin to see if it has significant wear and tear, which could also cause the gear to stop catching and motivating the brushes forward. Both left and right pinion gears and the dowel pins are available on the Brinly Parts store online. Continue to slide the large washer off of the axle, and using caution, pop the E-ring off of the divot in the axle using a small flat-tip screwdriver. Now repeat these steps on the other side, using pliers to bend the cotter pin at the end and pulling out the cotter pin from the end of the axle. Then remove the washers and the wheel from the end of the axle. Next, use the retaining ring pliers again to remove the second retaining ring. Slide off the pinion gear, and take note to catch the dowel pin if it falls out, or slide the dowel pin out of the axle. Check the dowel pins and the pinion gears for wear and tear, and make sure to note the L and R pinion gears are different orientations when ordering replacement parts. Removing the axle. Slide off the large washer and use a small flat-tip screwdriver to carefully remove the E-ring from the axle. Note: you may have to tap the axle lightly with a mallet to loosen it from the frame. Then, remove the brush spinners from the axle and slide the axle all of the way out of the frame. To remove the plastic dust cover, push it out from the top, slightly bending it to unsnap the clips from the frame. Replacement parts for the Brinly 54-inch lawn sweeper can be found on the Brinly online parts store. Replacing the axle. First, slide the axle back through the side plate. Note: when re-adding the brush holders to the axle, make sure the clamp ridge on the first set of 2 are pointed in the counterclockwise direction, And on the second set of brush holders, make sure the clamp ridges are pointed clockwise in the opposite direction of the previous set. When installed correctly, the pinhole extensions on the two center brush holders should be pointing inwards towards each other. Next, slide the axle all of the way through the second side of the frame, and using caution, snap the E-ring into place on the end of the axle with a pair of pliers. Then slide on the large washer and insert the pinion into the axle from the side so that it doesn't slide out. Place the pinion gear onto the axle, sliding it over the drive pinion to keep it in place. Then, slide on the small washer, placing it on top of the pinion gear. And using the retaining ring pliers, carefully expand the retaining ring and use your thumb to gently push the washer onto the end of the axle. And move it into place into the groove towards the end of the axle. Now snap the plastic dust cover back on by pushing the bottom clip into the frame first, and then pushing the top of the cover into the frame bracket slot until it snaps into place. Note, make sure both axle bearings are set into the bearing holes in the frame. The E-clip groove will not be accessible unless the bearings are in place and the axle is pushed all of the way through. Then repeat this step on the other side. Using pliers, very carefully snap the E-ring into place on the first groove of the axle. Replacing the wheel. Slide on the large washer and place the pinion into the hole in the axle from the side so that it doesn't fall out of the axle. Slide the pinion gear over the axle and dowel pin to keep the dowel pin in place. Then slide on the small washer, placing it into the top of the pinion gear, and using the retaining ring pliers, carefully expand the retaining ring into place in the groove towards the end of the axle. Now place the wheel back onto the axle with the gear teeth oriented inward. Slide two washers onto the end of the axle and add a small cotter pin to the hole in the end of the axle. Use a pair of pliers to bend both pin ends around the axle, securing the pin in place. Then add the other wheel to the axle with the gear teeth facing inward. Place the two washers onto the axle and add the cotter pin into the end of the axle, using pliers to bend the pin around the axle, securing it in place. You may need to use channel locks to hold the axle in place while bending the pin. Securing the brush sections. Secure the brush holders back in place by sliding the 4 cotter pins through the holes in the brush holder bases and the 4 holes in the axle. Use pliers or channel locks to bend the pins at a right angle to secure the brush holders in place on the axle. Assembling the brush sections. To assemble the brush clamps, first, place a small washer onto a small bolt and slide it through the brush holder from below. With the longer edge oriented in the back, place the brush holder top over the bolt and add another small washer and nut to the end. Place a section of the brush into the holder closest to the frame, making sure the brush is about 3/4 of an inch away from the sweeper frame. Then, using two 8mm wrenches, tighten the clamp around the metal top of the brush section, using caution not to over-tighten. Place the other side of the curved brush into the section of the brush holder that lines up with the top of the curved brush, which should be one away clockwise on the parallel holder section. Line the top edge of the brush section right below the hole and add a small washer to one of the bolts. Slide the bolt through the hole in the brush section and with the larger extension oriented towards the axle, place the top section through the bolt, adding another washer and nut to the end of the bolt. Use two 8mm wrenches to secure the brush section in place. Use an extremely low amount of torque if you are using a power tool, or the plastic brush holders will break if over-tightened with too much force. Additional brush holders can be purchased in the parts store at Brinly.com. After securing the brush section in place by lightly tightening the bolts fully, you can also pre-build the brush clamps before adding the brush sections by adding a washer to a bolt and sliding it through the base and top pieces with the longer extension in the top oriented towards the axle, and adding a second washer and nut, hand tightening only. Then, slide the end of the next brush section into the clamp, making sure it is 3/4 of an inch away from the sweeper frame, and tighten the clamp very carefully with two 8mm wrenches. Or, if you use a power tool for efficiency, be sure to apply a very light torque to avoid cracking the plastic clamp. Add the top of the curved brush section to the next clamp down clockwise on the parallel brush holder base and slide a washer onto a bolt, passing it through the bottom hole and adding the top of the clamp to the bolt with a larger extension in the back. Then add another small washer and nut to the end of the bolt to secure the brush in place. Gently tighten with two 8mm wrenches, and again, if you are using a power tool, go very slowly and use very little torque to avoid cracking the brush holder. Build the first clamp in the third brush set by adding a small washer to one of the bolts and passing it from below through the brush holder top and bottom, making sure the longer extension in the top is oriented closer to the axle, and add another washer and nut onto the bolt to form the clamp. Slide the third brush section into place so the metal top is touching the bolt and the edge is 3/4 of an inch away from the sweeper side plate. Tighten the clamp using two 8mm wrenches or very light torque with a power tool. Then, place the brush end into the lower brush holder and add a washer to a bolt, slide it through the brush holder from below, making contact with the metal top of the brush, and add the brush holder top with the larger extension oriented towards the axle and secure the brush in place by adding a washer and a nut, tightening with two 8mm wrenches or very lightly torqued with a power tool to avoid cracking the plastic. Now repeat this step on the other side. Add a washer to a bolt and pass it through the side of the clamp with the ridges, and from below, add the other side of the clamp to the bolt with the larger extension side still oriented towards the axle. Add a washer and a nut to the bolt below the clamp, securing by hand until the brush section is placed. Place the brush section into the clamp with the metal top touching the bolt, making sure the edge is 3/4 of an inch away from the sweeper side plate. Touching the top of the brush to the clamp one away clockwise to allow for the curve of the brush. Note, the brushes should slightly overlap in the middle. Add the other side of the brush to the clamp with the metal touching the bolt and secure the brush into the clamp with two 8mm wrenches or very lightly tighten with a power wrench to avoid cracking the clamp. Next, add a washer and bolt to the next brush section, and from below add the other side of the brush holder, a washer and a nut. Add the brush with the top touching the bolt, making sure the edge is 3/4 of an inch away from the sweeper side plate, very carefully tightening the nut to avoid cracking the plastic. Slide another washer and bolt through the other bracket, which should be one away counterclockwise. From below, add the bottom of the clamp and a washer and nut to the bolt, and add the top of the brush touching the metal to the bolt. The end of the brush should also align with the final clamp. Add a washer to a bolt and complete the final clamp around the brush, and then tighten both bolts on the clamps to secure the brush in place. Additional brush holders and other parts seen in this video can be purchased in the parts store at Brinly.com. For questions, call Brinly Customer Service at 877-728-8224. Brinly, since 1839.